Hello, I'm Dr. Craig Keebler. I welcome you to today's video, which will provide you with science-based data supporting the idea that ideal blood levels of vitamin D are far higher than most doctors and health agencies tell us. Two of the most renowned vitamin D scientists provide the strong data confirming this, and more importantly, their data defines exactly what an ideal, a natural, or a paleo level of vitamin D is. The main storage site for vitamin D in the body is the bloodstream, and the scientific name for the form of D that circulates through the blood is 25-hydroxyvitamin D. I simply call it 25D. If you're not familiar with 25D levels, then go to my website, drkeebler.com, and click on Vitamin D Facts for that information. We are currently in the pinnacle of a 42-year revolution in our understanding of vitamin D science. This chart shows the number of new scientific publications produced each year from 1980 through 2021. You can see the explosion in new information over that time period. And indeed, the last 10 years are the most dramatic in terms of new findings. And the next 10 years promise to be even more dramatic. Yet, shockingly, despite all this information, we still don't know what an ideal 25D level is. Now, there are two serious consequences of this ignorance. Number one, if the top vitamin D scientists can't agree on an ideal blood level for vitamin D, then certainly doctors and health agencies don't know what that level is, and as a result, they can't teach healthcare consumers what an ideal level is, nor help us reach such an ideal level. The second result of this ignorance is the fact that even scientists who are designing studies to see if higher levels of vitamin D can protect us from diseases or make them significantly less severe don't know what to aim for. They don't know what 25D level they should be trying to produce in these studies. Now, I'll ask you a simple question. What if the ideal 25D is not 30 nanograms per ml, but rather 50 or even 70 or 90? What can we do about this situation of our own ignorance? Is there any way to solve this problem? My answer to that question is an emphatic yes. Not only is it possible, but we already have the data to determine ideal 25D levels. I will present the hypothesis that we can gauge ideal 25D levels by asking the question, what did our most ancient human ancestors have as a vitamin D level? What I call Paleo 25D, or Paleo vitamin D level. After all, our genetic code was determined way back then and has changed very little since. D is actually a hormone that regulates hundreds of health-promoting genes, either by turning on genes that help promote health or turning off genes that promote disease. If our genes are indeed programmed to respond best to a certain level of 25D, then the next question is, what is that level of 25D that produces the best activation of our health-promoting genes? Let's first look at these ancient human ancestors. Where were they, and what conditions did they live under? Our most ancient ancestors developed in equatorial Africa and very gradually drifted up into the Nile, Jordan, Euphrates, and Tigris, and ultimately Indus River valleys, the area that we today call the Fertile Crescent. All these people had massive exposure to year-round sunlight, but also had dark skin to protect them from the very intense ultraviolet light they were exposed to. Yet enough ultraviolet did pass through that darker skin to produce plenty of vitamin D. We assume those people living in Equatorial Africa were hunter-gatherers, but we have no written or pictorial evidence of how they lived. People in the Fertile Crescent very gradually moved into agriculture. We have both written accounts and pictorial evidence of their lifestyles. This group mainly worked outdoors from sunup to sundown. They wore minimal clothing because of the heat during the day. And though they lived further north than the equatorial ancestors, these people still had year-round sunlight exposure. Conclusion: our most ancient human ancestors had high exposure to ultraviolet-rich sunlight throughout the year, producing lots of vitamin D and therefore high levels of 25D in their blood. But the question is, how high was their 25D? What was the paleo level of 25D? And is there any way to measure this using modern science? The 25D level produced in modern humans by exposure to ultraviolet-rich prolonged sunlight was determined way back in 1971. This was done by Haddad, who had developed the very first blood test to measure 25D. He tested his method on Americans, including the general public, and a smaller group of summer lifeguards who were exposed to 6.5 hours a day of sunlight without sunscreens for a total of 6 weeks. The general population had a 25D of 27 nanograms per milliliter. This is called vitamin D insufficiency. There's not enough 25D to produce optimal health. The lifeguards' 25D level was 64 nanograms per ml, more than double that of the general population. But we do know that it takes at least 3 to 4 months to produce a steady level of 25D after beginning supplemental vitamin D or when adding extra amounts of sun exposure. So these lifeguards only had 6 weeks of exposure. If they had had another 6 to 10 weeks of intense sun exposure, their levels would have been even higher than the 64. In fact, probably somewhere between 75 and 85 nanograms per ml. This scientific data confirms what our ancient ancestors' 25D level was likely to have been with the steady, intense, ultraviolet-rich sunlight that they lived with. And their 25D is very likely to have been quite similar to these summer lifeguards. That is between 75 and 85. That's about 3 times as high as the average American's 25D today. That means that most of us are walking around with about 1/3 the 25D that our ancient ancestors had when our human genome was being set. Remember that I said earlier that D is a hormone that regulates human genes, turning on genes that promote health and turning off genes that are harmful. Now, we've known for over 20 years that D regulates hundreds of human genes, but up to this point we didn't know exactly what the total number of D-activated or regulated genes were. The question arises, could higher 25D levels actually activate more health-promoting genes than lower 25D levels? A 2019 study by Shirvani of Michael Hollick's team answered that question for us. They took a group of young, healthy adults, divided into 3 groups with approximately equal numbers of men and women and ethnic groups. They made sure that none of them had taken any vitamin D supplement for 3 months before beginning the study. They then gave each group a slightly different amount of vitamin D each day for the next 6 months. At the end of the 6 months, they measured each group's 25D level and also measured how many genes were activated by that level. Now, in looking at the 3 doses here, 600 units is the amount that our government agencies tell us is their recommendation for healthy intake of vitamin D supplementation. 4,000 units is what our government agencies tell us is the upper limit of safety in daily intake of vitamin D. And 10,000 units a day is what the Endocrine Society claims is a reasonable upper limit with some caveats. 600 units a day produced a 25D level of 24 nanograms per ml. That is called vitamin D insufficiency. Hence, our government health agencies are telling us to take a daily dose of vitamin D that produces insufficient levels of 25D. Not only are they insufficient levels, but the dose they're recommending per day actually produces a 25D lower than what the average American has, which is 27. 4,000 units a day only produced a 25D of 41 nanograms per ml, a level which most D scientists believe is just the beginning of the potentially optimal or ideal level for 25D. And 10,000 units per day did not produce any toxic levels of vitamin D. Instead, it produced an average level of 79 nanograms per ml. Awfully darn close to the 75 to 85 nanograms per ml that the lifeguards would have had with another 4 to 6 weeks of sun exposure. Now let's see how many genes were activated by each daily dose of vitamin D. That will answer the very important question, do higher 25D levels activate more genes than do lower 25D levels? The 600 dose activated 162 genes. The 4,000 dose activated 360 genes, nearly twice as many. The 10,000 units activated 1,289 genes. That's 8 times greater than the 600 dose. We can now safely conclude that the higher the 25D, the greater the number of health-promoting genes that are activated. The bottom line here is that higher 25D levels clearly give us much more protection through gene activation than do lower 25D levels. 2 very different studies done by 2 different groups at 2 very different times both gave us a way to estimate what Paleo 25D levels were, and both studies came up with similar results. Our ancient ancestors most likely had 25D levels between 75 and 85, 3 times what the average American currently has. Now you have a choice to make. You can either be content with your present 25D, even though it's probably low, or you can consider taking action to improve your health. What can you do, and how do you do it? Number 1, consider testing your 25D to know where you are right now. If you are below what appears to be ideal 25D levels, work with your healthcare practitioner, be that a doctor, nurse practitioner, naturopath, physician assistant, to start D supplementation. If you are 60 years of age or older, be sure to have your practitioner draw a blood calcium level along with your 25D. Hyperparathyroidism becomes more common past the age of 60 and is often associated with low 25D levels. But if 25D levels are raised while hyperparathyroidism is still present and active, dangerously high levels of calcium in the blood can develop. Monitoring your 25D and blood calcium can help prevent this problem. Finally, if you choose to begin D supplementation, my video entitled How to Achieve Healthy Vitamin D Levels Safely and Effectively can give you additional guidelines and assist you in working with your healthcare practitioner. It is available to subscribers to this channel. Thank you for your interest and your attention. I hope you have a better sense of what paleo vitamin D levels are and why they're important. If you like the content of this video, please click on like. Also consider sharing this video and my website with anyone who you believe may benefit from the information. I welcome your comments and questions because they help me clarify fine points for you and other viewers. Let me know if you would be interested in participating in a live internet 30-minute conference with me on a specific preventive health topic. The number of participants would be limited to 20 viewers and would be available in the US time zones. Go to Dr. Keebler and click on live conferences. As always, the references for this video are available at my website, drkeebler.com. Click on video titles and then click on references for this video under the video that you're interested in. I look forward to seeing you again soon in another video.